For years after the divorce, Millionaire sees black ex-wife on a plane. Her twin kids leave him shocked. The leather seat of the Bentley still held the morning chill as David Whitmore adjusted his platinum cufflinks, staring out at the tarmac of JFK International Airport. At 38, he had perfected the art of looking composed even when his world felt like shifting sand. The driver held the door open, and David stepped out, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement with the precision of a metronome. "Mr. Whitmore, your boarding pass." His assistant Marcus handed him the first-class ticket to Dubai. "The summit materials are in your briefcase, and I've arranged for your usual suite at the Burj Al Arab." David nodded, barely listening. These business trips had become routine, a blur of handshakes, presentations, and networking dinners that meant everything and nothing at the same time. As heir to the Whitmore Hotel empire, worth over $3 billion, he had inherited not just wealth but a carefully constructed life where every detail was managed, every relationship calculated, every emotion kept in check. But there was one thing that had never quite fit into that perfect puzzle. One person who had made him feel like David, not just the Whitmore heir. Amara Ellis. For years since their divorce had been finalized in a sterile conference room with lawyers who charged more per hour than most people made in a month. For years since he'd last seen her warm brown eyes, heard her laugh echo through their penthouse, or watched her transform cold hotel spaces into homes with nothing but fabric swatches and an artist's vision. The divorce had been swift, clinical, and utterly devastating. One day they were planning a weekend getaway to the Hamptons, and the next, she was gone. The papers cited irreconcilable differences. But David knew better. The real reason had been the scandal. Photos of him allegedly leaving a hotel room with a socialite, headlines screaming about his betrayal, and the slow, painful realization that their marriage couldn't survive the weight of public scrutiny. What haunted him most wasn't the false accusation. They'd both known it was a setup, a photographer's trick with clever angles and timing. It was how quickly Amara had given up. How she'd signed every paper without a fight, taken her settlement, and disappeared from his life as if their 3 years of marriage had meant nothing. His mother, Judith Whitmore, had been surprisingly supportive during the divorce. "She wasn't right for our family anyway," she'd said over dinner at the Union Club. "Too independent, too different. You'll find someone more suitable in time." David had wanted to argue, but the words had stuck in his throat. By then, Amara was already gone, and arguing felt pointless. Now, walking through the terminal, David tried to shake off the familiar ache that came with thinking about her. He had a business to run, a reputation to maintain, and a life that looked perfect from the outside. That had to be enough. The first-class lounge was exactly what he expected: soft lighting, comfortable seating, and the kind of quiet that money could buy. He settled into a leather armchair with his laptop, preparing to review his presentation for the Dubai Hospitality Summit. The same presentation he'd given in various forms across 3 continents, about sustainable luxury and the future of 5-star service. "Flight 201 to Dubai, now boarding first-class passengers." David gathered his things, straightening his tie out of habit. The flight attendant smiled warmly as she checked his boarding pass, and he made his way down the jet bridge, already mentally preparing for the 14-hour journey ahead. The first-class cabin was spacious and elegant, with seats that converted to full beds and enough privacy to work or sleep undisturbed. David found his seat, 2A, as always, and began settling in. He pulled out his noise-canceling headphones and opened his laptop, ready to dive into quarterly reports. But as he stood to place his briefcase in the overhead compartment, he froze. 3 rows ahead, in seat 5B, sat a woman with familiar graceful shoulders and hair pulled back in a style he remembered from countless mornings. She was reading to 2 children, twins by the look of them, who were nestled on either side of her, their small faces rapt with attention. David's briefcase slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the cabin floor with a thud that made several passengers look up. But he barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in seat 5B and the impossible truth that was staring him in the face. Amara. After 4 years of silence, For years of wondering where she'd gone and whether she ever thought about him, here she was. But that wasn't the part that made his heart stop. It was the children. The little girl on Amara's left had dark hair that curled exactly like his had when he was young. The boy on her right had the same angular cheekbones that David saw in the mirror every morning, the same stubborn colic that no amount of expensive hair products could completely tame. They looked like him. They looked exactly like him. David sank into his seat, his mind racing. The timing was impossible to ignore. The children appeared to be around 4 or 5 years old, which meant, "Sir? Are you all right?" The flight attendant was looking at him with concern, and David realized he'd been staring at the back of Amara's head for several minutes without moving. "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "Just fine." But nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. As the plane prepared for takeoff, David found himself unable to look away from the small family 3 rows ahead. Amara's voice was soft and melodic as she read, the same voice that had once whispered his name in the dark, that had laughed at his terrible jokes, that had said, "I love you," like she meant it with every fiber of her being. The boy, Lucas, he heard her call him, had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his small hand clutching a stuffed elephant. The girl, Lena, was still awake, her bright eyes following along with the story. David's hands shook as he reached for his phone, wanting to call someone, anyone, to help him make sense of what he was seeing. But who could he call? His mother would ask too many questions. His assistant would think he was having a breakdown. His friends from the club would turn it into gossip by morning. The plane lifted off, carrying them all toward Dubai and toward answers that David wasn't sure he was ready to hear. But as they climbed through the clouds, one thing became crystal clear. The 4 years of silence were about to come to an end, and nothing in his carefully constructed world would ever be the same again. He had thought the divorce was the end of his story with Amara Ellis. But as he watched her gentle movements, her careful attention to the children who looked so much like him, it took his breath away. David realized it might have been just the beginning. The question that would haunt him for the next 14 hours was simple and terrifying. What else had he lost when he lost her? The first 3 hours of the flight were torture. David had ordered a whiskey, then another, trying to calm his racing thoughts, but alcohol only made everything more vivid. Every time Lena or Lucas moved, every gesture, every tilt of their heads, he saw himself as a child. Lucas had the same habit of running his fingers through his hair when he was thinking. David had done that exact same thing during board meetings just last week. Lena had a way of pursing her lips when she was concentrating that was identical to David's own expression when he reviewed contracts. The resemblance was so striking that David wondered how no one else on the plane had noticed. But then again, why would they? To everyone else, they were just a mother traveling with her children. To David, they were living proof that his entire understanding of the last 4 years had been built on a lie. When the flight attendant came by with the dinner service, David barely touched his food. He was too busy watching Amara help the twins with their meals, the way she cut Lucas's chicken into perfect bite-sized pieces, how she reminded Lena to drink her apple juice. She was patient, loving, everything he remembered and more. "Mommy, can I have more crackers?" Lena's voice carried back to him, and David's heart clenched. Her voice had the same slight rasp that David had inherited from his grandfather. "Of course, sweetheart," Amara replied, and David closed his eyes at the sound of her voice. For years, and it still affected him the same way. The flight attendant made a mistake with the meal service, bringing Amara's vegetarian option to David's seat and his beef dish to hers. David saw his opportunity and took it before he could lose his nerve. "Excuse me," he said, standing and walking to her row. "I think they mixed up our meals." Amara looked up, and for a moment, time stopped. Her dark eyes met his, and he saw recognition flash across her face, followed quickly by something that looked like panic. "David." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, Amara." He handed her the correct meal, his hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "It's been a long time." The twins looked up at him with curious expressions. Up close, The resemblance was even more overwhelming. Lucas had David's exact eye color, that unusual shade of green that everyone always commented on. Lena had the same dimple in her left cheek that David had been self-conscious about as a child. "Are you Mommy's friend?" Lena asked, her voice bright and innocent. David's throat tightened. We used to know each other." "Kids, finish your dinner," Amara said quickly, her voice strained. "And then we'll watch a movie on the tablet." David should have walked away then. Should have returned to his seat and pretended this encounter had never happened. But he couldn't move. He was staring at his children, and he knew with absolute certainty that's what they were, and trying to process the magnitude of what had been hidden from him. "Are those?" he started to ask, but Amara cut him off with a sharp look. "They're mine," she said firmly, her voice carrying a warning. "That's all you need to know." But David couldn't let it go. The way Lucas held his fork, the way Lena's eyebrows drew together when she was confused. These weren't coincidences. These were genetics, family traits, pieces of himself reflected in two small faces. "How old are they?" he asked, keeping his voice casual despite the fact that his world was crumbling and rebuilding itself simultaneously. 5, Amara replied after a pause. "They just turned 5. The math was simple and devastating. 5 years old meant they were born about 9 months after the divorce. Which meant, "Mommy, who is this man?" Lucas asked, looking between his mother and David with the directness that only children possessed. "Just someone Mommy used to work with," Amara said, but her voice was shaking now. "Go back to your dinner, baby." David wanted to say something, to claim his place in their lives, to demand answers. But the warning in Amara's eyes was unmistakable. Not here. Not now. Not in front of the children. He returned to his seat, his mind spinning. The flight attendant offered him another drink, but David declined. He needed to think clearly, to figure out what this meant, what he was going to do about it. An hour later, while he was pretending to read a business magazine, a small piece of paper appeared on his tray table. He looked up to see a flight attendant walking away, but she gave him a meaningful look and nodded toward Amara's section. David unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was written in Amara's familiar handwriting, the same script that had once filled love notes, and shopping lists and birthday cards. "You don't want to open this door at 40,000 feet. Wait until we land." David looked up to find Amara watching him. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes, he saw confirmation of everything he'd suspected. Fear, regret, and something else he couldn't quite identify. She turned back to the twins, who were now absorbed in the animated movie on her tablet, their small bodies curled against her sides. The perfect picture of a family. A family that should have included him. David folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. Dubai was still 11 hours away, and he had never felt time move so slowly. But Amara was right. This wasn't a conversation for an airplane. This was a conversation that would change everything. He just hoped he was ready for the truth. The Dubai airport was chaos, a maze of glass and steel filled with travelers from every corner of the world. David had expected to lose sight of Amara and the twins in the crowd, but he spotted them near the baggage claim, Lena asleep in her mother's arms while Lucas held tight to her free hand. David approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Amara." She turned, and the exhaustion in her eyes was unmistakable. The flight had been hard on her too. "We need to talk," he said quietly. She nodded, shifting Lena's weight. "There's a hotel near the terminal. The Millennium. Can you meet me there in an hour? Room 412. "What about them?" David's eyes fell on the twins. "They'll be with me. This concerns them too." She paused, then added, "But David, whatever you think you know, whatever you think you want, I need you to understand that some doors can't be unopened." An hour later, David stood outside room 412, his palms sweating despite the air conditioning. He changed from his travel clothes into a fresh shirt and pants, as if looking presentable could somehow prepare him for what was coming. Amara opened the door wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exactly as he remembered, but there was something harder in her expression now, something that hadn't been there during their marriage. "They're napping," she said, nodding toward the bedroom. "We have maybe 30 minutes before Lucas wakes up. He's an early riser, just like—" She stopped herself. "Just like me," David finished. "Amara, I need you to tell me the truth. Are they mine?" She gestured for him to sit on the small couch, then took the chair across from him. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as if weighing her words carefully. "Yes," she said finally. "Lena and Lucas are your children." The words hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd known. Hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting it. "How long have you known?" "Since the day I signed the divorce papers." Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "I found out I was pregnant that morning. 6 weeks along." David's mind reeled. 6 weeks? That means you knew during the entire divorce proceedings, and you never said anything? I couldn't say anything. The words came out sharp, defensive. "David, you have no idea what really happened." "What's your mother?" "My mother?" David leaned forward. "What does she have to do with this?" Amara stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Everything. She has everything to do with this." She turned back to him, her eyes blazing. "The scandal that broke up our marriage? The photos, the allegations? Your mother orchestrated all of it." "That's impossible. Those photos were real." "The photos were real, but the story was fabricated. Your mother hired investigators to follow you, photographers to take pictures at precisely the right moments. She set up the entire thing to make it look like you were having an affair." David felt like the floor was dropping out from under him. "Why would she do that?" "Because she knew I was getting too close to you. Too important to you. She saw me as a threat to her control over your life and the family business." Amara's voice grew harder. "But the photos were just the beginning. When I found out I was pregnant, I went to her first. I thought she deserved to know she was going to be a grandmother." "You went to my mother before you came to me?" "I was scared, David. Our marriage was falling apart, the media was calling me a gold digger, and I was carrying your children. I thought maybe, if she knew about the pregnancy, she'd help us work things out." Amara laughed bitterly. "I was so naive." "What did she do?" "She offered me money. A lot of money. $20 million to disappear completely, to never contact you again, never tell you about the pregnancy, never acknowledge that these children were yours." Amara's voice broke slightly. "And if I refused, she promised to destroy me. My career, my reputation, everything." David felt sick. "But you didn't take the money." "No, I didn't take it. But I signed the contract." She pulled a folder from her purse and handed it to him. "I had to. She had lawyers, David. Teams of them. They showed me what they could do, how they could make me disappear from the design world, how they could make sure I never worked again." David opened the folder with trembling hands. The contract was thick, filled with legal language that made his head spin. But one phrase stood out. "Complete non-disclosure and non-contact agreement. It's called a silence clause," Amara explained. "I can't contact you, can't mention your name to anyone, can't even acknowledge that you exist. If I break any part of this agreement, I forfeit custody of the twins and face financial penalties that would bankrupt me for life. This is insane. This can't be legal. It's perfectly legal. Your mother's lawyers made sure of that." Amara sat back down, her shoulders sagging. "For 4 years, I've been raising our children alone, terrified that someone would find out who their father really is. I've turned down jobs, avoided certain cities, lived in constant fear that I'd accidentally break this contract and lose everything." David stared at the contract, his mother's signature clear at the bottom. "She told me you took the money and moved on. She said you'd never really loved me. I never touched a penny of that money. I've supported myself and the twins through my work, living carefully, quietly. And David," she looked at him with tears in her eyes, "I loved you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. Losing you nearly me. A sound from the bedroom made them both freeze. Lucas was waking up. Mommy? Came a small voice. I'm here, baby, Amara called back. She looked at David with desperate eyes. Now you know the truth. But nothing changes. I can't break this contract, David. I won't risk losing them. But David was already standing, his jaw set with determination. We'll see about that. For the first time in 4 years, he knew exactly what he had to do. David's flight back to New York was a blur of rage and planning. He'd cancelled his meetings in Dubai, ignored Marcus's confused phone calls, and booked the first available flight home. The contract Amara had shown him was burned into his memory, every cruel clause, every calculated word designed to steal his children from him. But it was more than that. It was the realization that his entire life had been built on lies. His mother hadn't just destroyed his marriage, she'd stolen his chance to be a father when his children needed him most. She'd let him believe that Amara had abandoned him, that their love had meant nothing, that he was better off without her. The Whitmore estate in the Hamptons looked exactly as it always had, pristine, cold, and imposing. David found his mother in her study, dressed in her usual pearls and perfectly pressed suit, reviewing what looked like charity committee reports. David, darling. Judith looked up with surprise. I thought you were in Dubai until Thursday. We need to talk. David closed the door behind him and locked it. About Amara. About the contract you forced her to sign. For just a moment, Judith's composed expression faltered. Then she set down her pen and folded her hands. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. David threw the copy of the contract onto her desk. I've seen it. I've read every word. I know what you did. Judith picked up the contract, her eyes scanning it briefly before looking back at him. I see you've been in contact with your ex-wife. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate? David's voice rose. Mother, I have children. Twin children who have been living without their father for 5 years because of this monstrosity you created. Those children are better off without you, David. Just as you're better off without her. Judith's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. She wasn't suitable for our family. She would have held you back, made you weak. She made me happy. The words exploded out of him. For the first time in my life, I was actually happy. I was myself, not just the Whitmore heir, not just your perfect son. I was a man who was loved for who I was, not what I could provide. Happiness is a luxury we can't afford. Judith replied coldly. You have responsibilities, David. The business, the family name, the legacy your father and grandfather built. That woman was going to destroy all of it. No, Mother. You destroyed it. You destroyed my marriage, my family, my chance to know my own children. David began pacing, his anger building with each word. The scandal, the photographers, the allegations, you orchestrated all of it. I protected you from making a terrible mistake. You protected your control over me. David slammed his hand on the desk. You couldn't stand the thought that I might choose someone else over you, that I might build a life that didn't revolve around your approval. Judith stood up, her own anger finally showing. Everything I did was for this family. For you. Do you think I enjoyed watching you fall apart during the divorce? Do you think I wanted to see you hurt? But you did see me hurt. You watched me grieve for 4 years, believing that the woman I loved had thrown me away like garbage. You let me think I was unlovable, that I was destined to be alone. David's voice cracked. And all the while, my children were growing up without me. First steps, first words, birthdays, Christmas mornings, I missed everything. You would have been a terrible father anyway, Judith said cruelly. You're just like your father was, weak, emotional, easily manipulated by pretty faces. The words hit David like a slap. His father had died when David was 12, and Judith had spent the years since then systematically destroying every positive memory David had of the man. Don't you dare bring him into this, David said quietly. And don't you dare tell me what kind of father I would have been. You stole that chance from me. I saved you from a mistake that would have ruined your life. No, Mother. You saved yourself from losing control over mine. David picked up the contract. This ends now. I'm having my lawyers dissolve this agreement. I'm acknowledging my children publicly. And I'm removing you from any position of power in the company. Judith's face went white. You can't do that. The board will support me when they find out what you've done. When they realize that you've been using company resources to manipulate my personal life, to hire investigators and photographers, to pay off lawyers to draft illegal contracts. David's voice was steady now, filled with a cold determination he'd never felt before. You're done, Mother. Your control over my life is over. David, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about the family name, the reputation. I am thinking about family. I'm thinking about my children, who deserve to know their father. I'm thinking about the woman I love, who has been living in fear for 4 years because of your cruelty. David moved toward the door. I'm thinking about becoming the man I should have been all along. If you do this, you'll destroy everything we've built. David paused at the door. Good. Because what we built was never worth having. He left his mother standing alone in her study, surrounded by the trappings of a power that was already slipping away. For the first time in his adult life, David felt truly free. Free from her expectations, her control, her version of who he should be. He had children to meet properly, a woman to win back, and a life to rebuild. And he was going to do it all as himself, not as the Whitmore heir, but as David. Just David. The man he'd always been underneath all the lies. 3 weeks later, David stood outside a small brownstone in Brooklyn, holding a bag of art supplies and fighting the most intense case of nerves he'd ever experienced. Boardroom negotiations with hostile investors had nothing on this moment, meeting his children as their father. Amara had been cautious when he'd called. The contract dissolution was in progress, his lawyers working around the clock to untangle the legal web his mother had woven. But even with the legal barriers crumbling, the emotional ones remained towering. They don't know who you are, she told him over the phone. I've only said that you're someone important to me, someone who wants to get to know them. We have to take this slowly, David. They're just children. The door opened, and there she was, Amara, wearing jeans and a paint-stained sweater, looking more beautiful than he remembered. Behind her, 2 small faces peered out curiously. Hi, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hi, Lena replied, stepping forward boldly. Are you the man from the airplane? I am. David knelt down to her level. I'm David. I'm Lena, and that's Lucas. She pointed to her brother, who was hanging back shyly. Mommy says you brought us presents. David smiled, holding up the bag. I brought art supplies. Your mom told me you like to paint. I do. I painted a dragon yesterday, but Lucas said it looked like a purple chicken. Lena's indignation was adorable, and David found himself laughing. I'd love to see it. Dragons are my favorite. Really? Lena's eyes lit up. Even purple ones that might look like chickens. Especially those ones. Lucas finally stepped forward, his green eyes, so like David's own, studying him seriously. Are you going to stay for dinner? The question was simple, but it carried weight. David looked at Amara, who nodded slightly. If that's okay with you, David said. It's okay, Lucas decided. But I get to sit next to Mommy. Deal. The next few hours were a revelation. David watched his children with wonder, learning their personalities in real time. Lena was bold and talkative, showing him every drawing she'd made in the past month, chattering about her favorite colors and the story behind each painting. Lucas was quieter, more observant, but he warmed up gradually, especially when David mentioned that he owned hotels. Do you have maps of all your hotels? Lucas asked, his eyes bright with interest. I do. Would you like to see them? Yes. I love maps. I memorize them and then I can tell you how to get anywhere. David pulled out his phone and showed Lucas photos of the hotel layouts. The boy studied them with intense concentration, his small finger tracing the paths through lobbies and corridors. This one has a secret passage, Lucas announced, pointing to a service corridor in the Dubai property. How did you know that? It's hidden, but it's there. See how this wall is thicker than the others? David stared at his son in amazement. The boy was 5 years old and reading architectural plans like a professional. Over dinner, spaghetti with marinara sauce that both twins wore more than they ate, David began to understand what he'd missed. The way Lena hummed while she ate, how Lucas organized his food into perfect piles before taking a bite, the comfortable rhythm between mother and children that spoke of years of shared routines. Can David come see my room? Lena asked as they finished eating. If he wants to, Amara said carefully. I'd love to. Lena's room was an explosion of color and creativity. Paintings covered every wall, and art supplies were scattered across a small table by the window. But what caught David's attention was a drawing taped to the mirror, a family of 3 stick figures under a rainbow. That's me and Mommy and Lucas, Lena explained, following his gaze. It's beautiful, David said, and meant it. Sometimes I draw a daddy too, she added quietly. But Mommy says some families are different, and that's okay. David's throat tightened. Your mom is right. But Lena, would you like to have a daddy? She nodded seriously. All my friends have daddies. They go to the park and build things and read stories. I'd like to do all those things with you, David said. If you want me to. Are you going to be our daddy? The question was so innocent, so hopeful, that David had to blink back tears. I'm going to try very hard to be the best daddy I can be. That night, after the twins were in bed, David and Amara sat on the small couch in her living room, the silence comfortable for the first time in years. They're incredible, David said. You've done an amazing job raising them. They're good kids, Amara replied. They've been asking about their father for over a year now. I never knew what to tell them. And now I think they're going to be okay. They already adore you. She paused. Lucas organized his toys by color after you left. He said he wanted to make maps of his room like you showed him. David smiled. And Lena? She's planning to paint you a dragon that definitely doesn't look like a chicken. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle outside the window. It wasn't the ending David had imagined, but it was a beginning. A chance to build something real, something true. David, Amara said softly. Thank you for fighting for them. For us. Thank you for keeping them safe, he replied. For being strong enough to protect them when I couldn't. Outside, Brooklyn hummed with life, and inside, a family was slowly, carefully, beginning to heal. 6 months later, David stood in the lobby of his newest boutique hotel in Manhattan, watching Lena and Lucas redecorate the children's corner with crayons and an enthusiasm that would have horrified his mother. The sight of them sprawled on the carpet, debating whether the castle they were drawing needed more towers or a moat, filled him with a contentment he'd never known existed. The purple tower needs a flag, Lena announced, adding another flourish to their masterpiece. Dragons don't live in castles with flags, Lucas replied seriously. They live in mountains. This dragon is different. She likes castles and tea parties. David smiled, remembering when he'd first learned that Lena's dragons were always female and always friendly. It had been during their second weekend together, when she'd patiently explained that scary dragons were boring, and that her dragons preferred making friends to hoarding treasure. Mr. Whitmore? His assistant Marcus approached cautiously. David had trained his entire staff to be careful around the twins, not because he was ashamed of them, but because he was fiercely protective of their privacy. The legal documents are ready for your signature, Marcus said quietly. David nodded. Today was the day everything became official. The NDA had been dissolved completely, Judith had been removed from the board of directors, and the papers that would legally acknowledge Lena and Lucas as his children and heirs were waiting in his office upstairs. Kids, I need to take care of some business. Do you want to come with me, or stay here with Marcus? Can we see your office? Lucas asked, immediately interested. Is it on the top floor? Does it have a view of the bridge? It is, and it does. I want to see. Lena scrambled to her feet, crayon still in hand. 20 minutes later, David sat at his desk with a pen in his hand, looking at the documents that would change everything. The twins were pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, marveling at the view of the city spread below them. Amara sat across from his desk, her own copy of the documents signed and waiting. She wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and when she smiled at him, David felt the same flutter in his chest that he'd felt when they first met. Are you ready? She asked softly. David signed his name with steady strokes, making it official. Lena Ellis Whitmore and Lucas Ellis Whitmore were now legally recognized as his children, with all the rights and protections that entailed. Trust funds had been established with Amara as the primary trustee, ensuring their futures were secure regardless of what happened between their parents. Daddy, look! Lena had abandoned the window and was now examining the family photo on his desk, a picture from last week when they'd all gone to Central Park together. It was the first photo David had ever displayed in his office that wasn't related to business. The word daddy still made his heart skip. It had taken 3 months for the twins to start calling him that naturally, and he treasured it every time. I see it, sweetheart. Can we put our castle drawing next to it? Absolutely. Lucas joined them, studying the photo seriously. We look like a real family. We are a real family, David said, lifting him up so Lucas could get a better view of the city. That evening, they had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, nowhere fancy, nowhere that would attract attention. Just a family enjoying pasta and each other's company. The twins were getting sleepy, Lena's head drooping against Amara's shoulder while Lucas fought to keep his eyes open. I should get them home, Amara said, but there was no urgency in her voice. Stay a little longer, David asked. Please. Over the past 6 months, they'd found their rhythm as co-parents. David visited most weekends, sometimes during the week. He'd taken them to museums, parks, and kid-friendly restaurants. But he and Amara had been careful not to rush into anything romantic. Too much had been broken, too much trust needed to be rebuilt. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like they were ready to be more than just co-parents. Lena asked me something yesterday, Amara said quietly. She wanted to know if you were going to marry me and if we could all live in the same house. What did you tell her? I told her that grown-ups have to figure some things out first. Amara looked at him across the table. Have we figured them out? David reached for her hand. I love you, Amara. I never stopped loving you. And I love the family we've built together, even if it happened in the most backwards way possible. I love you too, she whispered. But David, this has to be different from before. No more secrets, no more outside interference. If we do this, it's just us, you, me, and the twins. Just us, he agreed. No more clauses, no more control from anyone else. A small voice interrupted them. Are you going to kiss now? Lena was peeking at them from under her eyelashes, not nearly as sleepy as she'd appeared. David laughed, and Amara blushed. Maybe, David said. Would that be okay with you? Yes, but Lucas is asleep, so you have to be quiet. So David kissed Amara softly, carefully, like a promise being made in a restaurant full of strangers while their children dozed nearby. It tasted like forgiveness and hope and the future they should have had all along. Later, when Lena was tucked into bed and asked her nightly question, "Will you be here when I wake up?" David was able to give a different answer than usual. "I'll be here," he said, and meant it completely. "I'm not going anywhere ever again." For the first time in 5 years, David Whitmore was exactly where he belonged, home.